In this video, we're going to look at extracting as much power as possible from your diesel engine. We're focusing primarily really on turbo diesel engines. It's a general guide, so I'm going to try and cover all of the nuances involved in tuning the various diesel engines out there. But please let me know in the comments what version you've got, what model you've got, and we can tailor future videos to answer some of the questions that you raise in the comments on this video. But we're going to try and give a really good overview of all the steps and all the mods that work really well on a diesel engine based on our experience, my experience, and feedback that we've had from our forum members on our website and channel viewers as well. So the whole aim of tuning your diesel engine is to get it to burn more fuel and more air. Now, diesel engines work very differently to gasoline engines. So firstly, the primary difference is the way the fuel is burnt. Firstly, the cylinder will compress the air charge, and that air charge, because it's highly compressed, will be extremely hot. And just before the topmost position of the piston, the fuel is injected into the cylinder. The really hot atmosphere that it's been injected into will cause the fuel to atomize and then combust. And that's where you start getting the burn happening. Now, with diesel engines, the burn is happening in multiple locations, and you tend to run out of oxygen to burn around the injector. That's where the focus is. So if you get it wrong, you just end up producing a lot of soot. There's just not enough oxygen to fully burn all of the fuel, and you get a very, very smoky result at the end. So the way the air goes into the cylinder is a major consideration for manufacturers. They want to swirl the air to maximize the way it mixes with the fuel at that point of combustion. And also the injection cycle, the way the fuel sprayed into the chamber, the pattern, the mist, the smaller they can get the droplets, the better the overall burn will be. So diesel engines typically have much higher compression ratios than the equivalent gasoline or petrol powered cars. The typical compression ratio of your diesel engine varies from around 16:1 to around 20:1, but there are some configurations and setups that even exceed that, going up to even levels of 30:1 compression ratios in the case of indirect injection engine. The air to fuel ratios of a diesel engine also varies considerably. In a gasoline engine, you need to keep that air to fuel ratio fairly consistent. But in a diesel engine, that air to fuel ratio can vary from 18:1 to as much as 70:1 in some cases. So at idle, a typical diesel engine might have an air to fuel ratio of around 40:1, but as soon as that engine comes under load, that ratio may drop to about 18:1. So those are factors that are very much controlled within the ECU, and it's fed by all the sensors around the engine. And lots of other factors have been taken into account by the manufacturer. So when you're tuning an engine, you're really working with whatever parameters the engine designer has built into their engine. So it does help to have a little bit of an understanding of the engine you're actually working on. So first up, we're going to highlight some of the mods that people often do, but they don't make that much of a difference to your diesel engine's power output. Then we're going to focus on the really big power mods, those mods that make a dramatic difference to power. We're going to finish up with the most cost-effective mod in terms of the performance you get for the amount of money that you spend doing that mod. And we're going to look as well at some of the other sensible mods that you should be thinking about just to ensure that you can make the most of the power that you're actually getting from your tuned diesel engine. So the first mod that people often talk about is induction kits. Now, bear in mind that your average diesel engine, just because of the way it works, the way it burns fuel, you'll never see diesel engines revving much beyond 7,000 RPMs. There's a significant difference in the revs that you can get out of a diesel engine. So maximizing the airflow into the engine, it's certainly something to think about. But an induction kit and changing the air filter and the way the air goes into the engine is not really going to gain much power because manufacturers have over-specified most setups. So just fitting an induction kit on a standard diesel engine will in real terms not make very much difference to the power. In cars I've had, it's made the economy slightly better, oddly enough, but I certainly didn't really notice much of a difference. When you put these cars on the dyno, you may get about 7% more power, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not really something you're going to notice in day-to-day driving, and the money that you would spend on an induction kit or an induction upgrade is certainly better spent elsewhere. So getting air into the engine is important, but also getting the air out of the engine after it's burnt is also just as important. So people often look to sports exhausts. Now, again, with most diesel engines, the manufacturer's exhausts flow fairly well. You will typically find a restriction though in the pollution controls that have been added. So in a diesel engine, that will typically be a catalyst and or a DPF filter. So depending on the age of the engine and which emissions regulation standards it's been designed to meet will determine which of these devices you have and how aggressive it is. But commonly the restrictions that we see are often with those components. Now, manufacturers have tried to push their cars out at a set price point, so they don't overinvest in these things. They just want to make sure the car meets the emissions at the lowest price they can. So a lot of compromises are often made in manufacturer setups of the DPFs. You can get better flowing sports alternatives of both DPFs and catalysts. So generally they're larger, they are less restrictive of the airflow coming out of the exhaust. And if you're experiencing some kind of restriction in the exhaust, then that is probably the best area to focus on. So I need to just point out, in a lot of areas, a lot of modifications to cars are illegal if they affect the emissions output of the car. So removing catalysts and DPF filters is illegal in most regions. There are a few regions that still permit that modification, or they actually look at the vehicle's emissions rather than just banning any car that should have one that's had it removed. And in some areas it's even illegal to remove a working catalyst or DPF filter and replace it with a better flowing sports alternative. So do check those legalities in your region and your area, and just make sure you're not going to fall foul of any of your annual inspections or roadside checks that may be carried out. On some engines we've noticed that the actual headers on the exhaust, the intake manifold as well, could potentially be better designed. So if you've got a tuning project and you're pushing extreme gains in the power levels, then it certainly would be worth thinking about upgrading those components. So what's the biggest power gain that you can get on a turbo diesel engine? Well, it's all about burning air and fuel, and diesels are relatively forgiving in the air to fuel mix. There's a big variation in what will actually work. So forcing more air and more fuel into the engine is generally the way you would go to achieve more power. There's lots of nuances involved, and as I said earlier, you will get a lot of soot if you do it wrong. So you want that air and fuel to mix as cleanly as possible and give the cleanest possible burn. But the turbocharger is doing a lot of work in forcing that air into the engine. So the characteristics of the turbo, the way it spools up and the way it delivers the boost of power, will have a big bearing on the drivability of the car. So a turbocharger works by using the exhaust gas flow to drive a turbine that's connected to the intake, and that on the intake will actually compress the air as it comes in. So there's a lot of technology that's gone into modern turbo units, and we've seen variable vane turbos actually alter the angle of the air as it hits the exhaust side of the turbo to maximize its spool up, and they can be adjusted to allow the turbo to spin more freely, to maintain higher power figures, or just to change the power profile for more desirable characteristics, or just to improve the economy of the engine. So bolting on a big turbo, that's obviously an upgrade path you can take. It can be quite expensive. Sometimes it can be quite complex because you need to address all of the pipe work and the way it connects to the engine. So most people looking for a turbo upgrade will go for a hybrid turbo. So that's a turbo where you've got a standard turbo casing and you've uprated the internals. So those little turbines inside the turbo have been changed. Maybe even the turbo's been channeled out to enhance the airflow through the turbo, just to allow the use of slightly larger turbines within the turbo. So there is generally a bit of a trade-off on your diesel turbo. If you have a large turbo that gives big power at the top end, you tend to get a little bit more lag at the bottom end. But with the technology and the design that's gone into it, that's not usually that much of a concern nowadays. You can generally get a turbocharger that delivers the power exactly as you want it. So that's addressed getting more air into the engine, and turbos are one of the biggest power upgrades that you can do to your diesel engine. So the diesel fuel system is critical. You obviously need to burn more fuel to make more power. There are limits though. If you put too much fuel in, you'll get a very, very sooty burn. It won't be very clean and efficient. You'll probably fall foul of emissions laws as well, and you'll just be wasting fuel. So there is an optimum amount. So the fuel system divides off into two parts really. You've got the fuel pump that generally pressurizes the fuel system, and you've got the injectors. Now don't think of the injectors of most diesel engines as squirting the fuel. All they are is little gates that allow the fuel to exit when they get a signal from the computer inside the engine. So the response time of the injectors is also important. You want those injectors to respond very, very quickly to the signals to inject fuel into the engine. So when it comes to the fuel injectors, the size of the droplet produced, the spray pattern, and even the size of the hole, the amount of fuel that can flow out of them, are big factors to take into account when tuning an engine. But there will be limits on how much fuel an injector can possibly flow. And a lot of that is down to limitations in the fuel pump system. So in most cases, if you want to go for those higher power figures, you need to address the fuel pump and get more pressure into the fuel system in order to release more fuel into the engine and reach those tuning goals that you've been aiming for. So people ask us about camshaft upgrades on turbo diesel engines, and depending on the engine, you can see some sort of power gain changing the profile of the cam. So the cam lobe, as it rotates, has a direct bearing on the way the valves on the intake side and the exhaust side open and close. You want a little bit of overlap as well, but getting that set up, it's a bit of an art. You really do need to understand the engine, but most manufacturers have got some kind of variable valve timing system built in, which really does the work of extending those cam profiles. So research your engine carefully. Dropping a set of cams in an engine without the variable valve timing is probably a significant upgrade on most diesel engines, but with cams, they do tend to enhance the power at the top end, and diesel engines have a very narrow power band. So I would have to say that cam upgrades are questionable on most diesel engines. Let me know in the comments your experiences and what you think about cam upgrades on a diesel engine. So another area to think about is the intercooler. So this is a big radiator that takes the compressed air from the turbo. Now that air has become rather hot, and hot air carries less oxygen, so you're going to get less of a burn from that oxygen charge as it goes into the engine. So if you can lower that intake temperature, you'll be able to get the air to carry more oxygen into the engine, and you'll see a slightly larger power increase. So the intercooler itself, it doesn't really add power. It just maximizes the opportunity you get of taking power out of the intake charge. And the problem you will have with most intercoolers is they start to warm up. So as the metal of the intercooler gets warmer, it becomes less effective at cooling that air charge down. So at some point it's going to become very ineffective and you're going to be substantially down on power. Now we would call that heat soak. So the best way of avoiding heat soak is by upgrading the capacity of the intercooler. So most car manufacturers tend to have a low performance variant and a high performance variant within their model lineup, and they tend to put bigger intercoolers on the high performance variants. So often a very simple cheap upgrade is to just get the intercooler from the high performance variant and put that into your lower powered engine to be able to see less heat soak and benefits from that upgrade. But there are a wide range of aftermarket intercoolers around. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking that larger intercoolers are always better. You can inadvertently add a bit of a restriction on the intake if the intercooler is the wrong shape, the wrong size, or its flow characteristics are not correct. And often when you have a larger bore capacity, you're slowing up the airflow. So although theoretically it can carry more air, that air is often traveling more slowly. And you really want a high velocity of air going into your engine to maximize the amount of oxygen laden air that you can get into the cylinders just before that burn process. And another issue you might well have, it's quite a nice problem to have, and that's getting the traction. You're putting so much more power down, sometimes you can really scrabble to get some grip at some points. So the differential is probably the logical upgrade to do there, particularly if it's a front wheel drive car. You can have a big change on the way the car works just by upgrading the differential, maybe with a torque sensing differential or something that's a little cleverer than just the mechanical thing that the manufacturers have chucked in to keep the costs down. So the EGR valve is the exhaust gas recirculation valve. So is that something that's going to damage your performance? Well, most EGR systems only operate at light throttle and when the engine is warming up. So at wide open throttle under load, when you want the maximum performance from your engine, your EGR valve is naturally closed. So the problem that a lot of people have with the EGR valve though is that they clog clog up, they fill up with soot. And with any engine that's burning fuel, particularly diesel fuel, you are going to get soot building up. It'll typically build up around the head of the engine. The EGR valve itself, it's not surprising it clogs up in there because it's quite a complex pipe system. There's a valve there that opens and closes and regulates the flow of exhaust gases into the intake. And modern systems are actually quite well designed. So should you actually delete it? Well, in most areas, regions and states, if you want your car to be legal, you shouldn't delete it because an EGR delete will generally render your car illegal. The emissions will not be within the standards that the authorities expect. So if they did an inspection on your car and found it deleted, you could find yourself with some sort of citation or fine or getting your car confiscated. But a lot of people are going out and investigating EGR delete kits. So these can vary in price wildly from just a basic blanking plate that blanks off the EGR valve and the intake as well. Some have a cooler system as well connected to them, so you would just need to work all of that in. So do your research carefully. Make sure you get a good quality EGR kit that's designed for your engine. If you do have an engine that you can just blank off successfully, then by all means go for it. But there's nearly always a requirement to make an adjustment in the ECU. So if the engine computer detects that the EGR valve is not working properly, i.e. it's been blanked off, it's going to flag up some kind of error. It may even back off on the performance. So EGR deletes are both a physical modification that has to be done to an engine, but they also require a software adjustment to be done. The flywheel, that's the big metal plate on the side of the engine that stores the kinetic energy and helps to smooth out the rotation of the engine. So it's a good idea if you've got a dual mass flywheel to stay with a dual mass flywheel. The single mass flywheels on those engines can introduce quite a few lumps and other problems with idling. So a lot of people have complained that they've gone with a much lighter single mass flywheel, but there are lighter performance dual mass flywheels around. So what is the most significant cost-effective upgrade that every owner of a turbo diesel engine should think about? So manufacturers have come up with what they call a map that tells the engine what to do at any specific point of load and RPM point. The electronic control unit, the electronic computer unit. Most manufacturers have got different names for this computer that's inside the engine, controlling all the aspects of the engine. And here in the UK and in a lot of Europe, we refer to this process as remapping. So within the ECU, you essentially have a map, a table, a chart, and that chart or table or map allows the engine to determine what to do in order to get the power that you actually need, depending on your throttle, your engine RPM, and the speed the car is traveling at. There's a big difference between diesel engines and conventional fuels, such as gasoline or petrol, depending on where you live. They've also got different names. In a diesel engine, the ECU is controlling the amount of fuel that is injected into the engine and also the duration, the start point when the fuel is injected and the end point. So by controlling that, you have a big degree over the amount of power that the engine makes. And depending on where your foot is on the throttle, the RPM speed of the engine and the speed you're actually traveling at and the prevailing conditions, the temperature of the air going into the engine, they all have a bearing on the amount of fuel and the duration of the fuel being injected. So by altering that map inside the computer, you can make fairly substantial power gains and completely change the way the power is delivered. And in a modern turbo diesel engine, that ECU or the computer inside the engine is also controlling the turbo boost by means of a valve, which allows control over the wastegate, which is the flow of the exhaust gases through the turbo. So by limiting the amount of exhaust gases in the turbo, you're restricting the boost. And by opening that up wide, you can increase the boost. So obviously in conditions where you're just driving along with no throttle, you don't need lots of boost. You don't need to be burning lots of fuel. But if you want to accelerate hard and you've got your foot flat on the throttle and the engine is already at a fairly high RPM level, you really do need to ramp up the boost and ramp up the fuel accordingly. So just by altering those parameters inside the computer, you can make a big difference to the way that the power is actually delivered. Manufacturers themselves tend to build in quite a wide margin for error. The quality of the fuel used has a big bearing on the way that the fuel burns and how efficient it is inside the engine. So manufacturers take into account that some countries have very low quality fuels and others often have a choice of premium fuels or lower quality fuels. The prevailing atmospheric conditions, the temperatures that cars operate in, all have a big bearing. So manufacturers have basically come up with a map or a table within the computer that allows the car to perform well in all of these different environments and setups. So when you take your car in and have it reprogrammed, remapped, flashed, whatever you want to call it, you're limiting that amount of flexibility the engine has, and you're really dialing it down to suit your local needs. And also, as a driver of a car, you want to keep your car in good condition, so you don't have to build in the margin for error for bad maintenance that manufacturers build into their generic maps. So there's various ways of achieving a remap to change the map that the engine is working from. So a remap will generally be done by plugging a computer or laptop into the OBD port, the OBD2 port on modern generation turbo diesel engines, and that'll allow the mapper to download the map, make adjustments, upload it, and you'll be completely set to go. There's piggyback ECUs, so in the case of some of the older ECUs that can't be mapped, you can replace the ECU or get a piggyback ECU that takes over from your factory fitted ECU. So a piggyback ECU, or a tuning box as some people like to call them, but don't confuse them with the cheap tuning boxes. A proper piggyback device or a tuning box will actually take readings from the sensors coming around the engine, and they will lie to the ECU, forcing the ECU to work to a different set of parameters, and maybe even take the readings that the ECU is spitting out, the instructions, and modify them slightly so the engine's characteristics are somewhat different from what the ECU thinks it's working with. For the best effect on your car, you should really take it to a rolling road and get it mapped by a specialist that can create a bespoke map. So every diesel engine that comes off the production line is different. They're not all exactly the same power. They don't use exactly the same quality of components. So the only real way you can extract the maximum power from your specific engine is to get it set up properly on a rolling road. You'll often pay a bit of a premium for that, but it really is worth the investment, especially if you've done other mods, because most mappers will just be working to very generic setups. So some remapping companies don't actually do the map themselves. They just have a whole chart of maps on the shelf effectively. And when you bring a car in with a specific make and model engine, they will take off a generic map and apply that to your vehicle. Although that map is better than what the manufacturers have originally designed within your ECU, and it may well be tailored to your environment, your country, your region, and the fuel types that you use, it is still a generic map. You won't be getting the absolute maximum, but it's probably a safe alternative because there's still quite a big margin of error built into those generic maps. So most turbo diesel engines will see a power gain of about 30 to 40%. And the annoying thing to owners of gasoline or petrol powered vehicles is you will often see better fuel economy as well with that extra power that you're getting. The engine is just becoming much more efficient. It's much more able to extract power from the fuel that's going into it. So remapping a diesel is certainly a bit of a no-brainer. It's one of the easiest mods you can do, and it will make a significant difference not only to the power you get, but to the way that the power is delivered. A lot of companies out there that just offer a budget service to alter the program within the computer are essentially just dumping more fuel in. Now that may potentially make more power. You're burning more fuel after all, but it often produces a lot more soot. So that finer control that you get with a modern diesel engine with the injectors that are very, very precisely controlled, particularly on the CR type engine setups as opposed to the older PD version. So particularly with the more modern diesel engines, those with a common rail setup and very flexible injectors that allow a lot more control over the duration and the spray patterns to some extent as well, you can do a lot more to fine tune the power delivery and get the maximum response from the engine. So bear in mind that your piston is moving up and down. So generally when it's at the uppermost point, the maximum amount of compression has gone on with that air that's inside. And that's really the point you want the fuel to start igniting. So in order to get that fuel igniting at that point, you need to inject it slightly before. So you can actually see it's quite a complex area. It's certainly not something we're going to go into in this video, but you need to work out how many degrees before that top dead center point is optimum to get the amount of fuel into the engine itself in order to burn and deliver the power when you want it the most. Firing that fuel in too early can obviously have problems. If it starts to burn too early, you may well be pushing against a piston that's going up, which would be to the detriment of power and may actually be damaging the engine. So the computer inside the engine is certainly not something you can just jump into and start fiddling around with the parameters yourself. You do need to understand the complexities of what's going on in a modern turbo diesel engine in order to extract more power. And different manufacturers have slightly different setups with the engines. They work to slightly different parameters. So it really does pay to choose someone with an expertise and knowledge in your particular engine, rather than going to these companies that just offer a generic service for all different types of engine out there. Beware of just remappers that are quoting a very high peak power figure. You don't really want a big spike at the top end. You want that power delivery to go throughout the RPM range. And we'd certainly recommend that you don't have too much power coming on at the low end of the RPM range, because that will just result in lots of wheel spin. And your turbo really needs that little bit of a zone to cool down, because that turbo is running quite hot. And if you overboost the turbo at the low RPM regions, you're going to add a lot of extra wear and tear to your turbocharger itself. So whenever you work your engine harder through a remap, through upgrades, it's a good idea to reduce those service intervals. You're putting extra strain on all of the components. Now, thankfully, diesel engines are extremely strongly made. They work to very high compression ratios, so a lot of work has gone into making the engines as tough as possible, and they last for ridiculous amounts of mileage. The fuel itself is a lubricant, so that reduces the wear and tear. You're effectively flowing oil into the cylinder as part of the combustion process. So with a gasoline engine, the gasoline will tend to strip away that lubrication, but in a diesel engine, you don't have that same problem. So that's why diesel engines tend to last a lot longer. They're so well made, and just the nature of the way the engine works and the fuel it's using will have a big bearing on its lifespan. So most people have nothing to worry about. The common weak spots when you've tuned a diesel engine is usually the clutch. It's delivering a lot more torque than maybe was designed, and most clutches are starting to get on a bit at the point the owner decides to take it in and get a remap done on it. So you may well start to experience a slipping clutch. You can do a few tests just to see the condition of your clutch before you take it in for a remap, and a good remapper will actually run a full diagnostic on your engine just to make sure that everything is working as it should, that you've got no dodgy sensors or relays within the engine that could start to fail or cause problems with the tighter parameters that you're working to with the remap. So I hope this video has been informative to you. It's given you a really good overview of diesel tuning, the mods that work, the mods that don't work. We'd love you to stay tuned, so please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so, and please boot that like button, because that really helps us to get out there. We've got lots more stuff coming up on diesel engines, helping you to get the best out of your diesel engine. We've got videos on should you remove your DPF. We're going to look at the EGR valve as well, what that is, if you should remove that or not, and whether that will have an effect on your performance. So there's lots of stuff coming up on this channel for you diesel owners. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.